webinar series brought to you by the American English team in Washington, D.C. We are so excited to see so many teachers from all different parts of the world joining us today. And here on the screen, you can actually see just one group of teachers joining us from Kenya. And we'd like to see all of our viewing sessions from around the world. So if you're watching this webinar with a group, take a photo and send it to americanenglishwebinars@elprograms.org. We'd love to see all of our participants. My name is Moderator Jenny, part of the American English team, also known as Moderator Jenny. And you'll see my friends, Moderator Katie and Moderator Amy, in the chat box to help you. As you know, the webinar program is called the American English Webinar Series, and each session is 60 minutes long. Our topics are related to the Teacher's Corner that can be found on the American English website at americanenglish.state.gov. Here you can see the schedule for this webinar series. And we have lots of exciting topics to look forward to in the months of February and March. During these webinars, you will hear but not see the presenter, and the way for you to participate is by typing in the chat box. This is where you can ask questions and make comments related to today's topic. We know that sometimes we can't get to everybody's question, so there's another place for you to ask additional questions after the webinar is over, and we'll show you that in just a few minutes. The presenter may also ask you questions in the form of polls, and these are just multiple choice questions that will appear on the screen. And we do know that sometimes you might have technical difficulties, and while we'll try to help you and let you know if we're having a global issue, a great way to follow along if you do lose sound is by watching the caption pod, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. In each webinar series, there are 6 sessions, and they take place every other Wednesday. If you'd like to earn an e-certificate, you need to attend at least 4 out of 6 of the webinars, and this certificate will be sent to you by your U.S. Embassy or Regional English Language Officer. We want to make sure that if you do attend at least 4, you do receive your certificate, so it's very important to submit your attendance at the end of the session. We will only accept attendance at the very end of the webinar, and we will send you a link to submit this information. We hope that all of you have visited our Ning site, americanenglishwebinars.com. But if you haven't, it's a great site to join. You do need to register. And this is where you'll find the recordings of all of our previous webinars. So we've had years of webinars, so if you haven't been joining us for long, you can find them there. Discussions about each webinar, readings, and this is also where you can ask additional questions from our presenter in case you don't get everything answered today. We're very excited to announce that we have a new Facebook page, the American English Facebook page for educators. So this is a place where all English teachers from around the world can join. They can find additional resources, events, and just be able to talk with other teachers around the world. Right now, we have a very special campaign going on. We're very interested in seeing what different classrooms look like from around the world. So if you have time and the next time you're teaching, if you want to take a picture of your class and send it to the Facebook page with #myclassroom, we'd love to see what it looks like. Okay, so we're very excited about today's session called The Flipped Classroom, Preparing Students for In-Class Learning with Online Activities. So in this webinar, the presenter will explore ways to enhance student learning through online activities, specifically by modeling one of the latest trends in education today, which is called the flipped classroom. And this refers to moving lecture outside of the class through online activities and using class time to do more practice. So the presenter will answer your questions such as, what are open education resources and how can I use them to begin flipping parts of your course? How can I help students to be more autonomous? What do English language learners think about flipped learning? How can I use different technologies to blend teaching and learning? And our presenter, Andrew, will provide answers to these and also offer practical advice for how you can begin to flip your classroom. Okay, so I'm so excited to introduce our presenter, Andrew Screen. After serving as a Peace Corps volunteer in Costa Rica, Andrew earned his master's in international TESOL from American University. Andrew has taught intensive English at Georgetown University since 2010, and he enjoys experimenting with new and creative ways of enhancing learning for his students. Andrew is constantly seeking ways to make the language learning process both more enjoyable and more efficient for students and teachers alike. So let's give Andrew a big warm welcome.
Thank you, moderator Jenny, for that introduction. Welcome to webinar 2.2, the flipped classroom, preparing students for in-class learning with online activities. I'm Andrew, and I'm honored to have the privilege to speak with you today for this webinar. Now, I've looked back at the poll, the pre-webinar poll, and it's been really interesting to me to look and see the numbers changing. You can see that about just under 50% of you have said that you have never heard of flipping, whereas about 3 to 4% of you have said that you have in fact flipped. So that's a pretty big range right there. And one of my goals for today's webinar is to try to address both groups, to make sure that I'm giving practical advice and explaining more or less how a flip might work and how you could use it, while at the same time hoping that some of our participants who have in fact already flipped might be able to benefit from this presentation as well and contribute to our chat board and in our discussions afterwards. So first, let's start with the concept of flipping and flipped learning. Here's what I hope to talk about in this presentation. Well, what is flipped learning and why flipped learning? And how can you flip learning? And finally, we'll conclude with some final thoughts, my advice on flipping and integrating in-class learning with online activities. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and look at the flipped classroom. Now, flipped learning, one definition is that it's a pedagogical approach, or a teaching approach, in which direct instruction moves from the group learning space to the individual learning space. And the resulting group space is transformed into a dynamic, interactive learning environment, where the educator guides students as they apply concepts and engage creatively in the subject matter. Now, that's courtesy of the Flipped Learning Network. And what I want to focus on here is thinking of instruction moving from the group learning space to the individual learning space. Now, another definition, which many of you have already contributed and talked about in our discussions on the NING, is the flip and the 4 pillars. And the 4 pillars are basically foundations or principles of flipping. So we think of the F being a flexible environment, L for learning culture, I for intentional content, P for the professional educator. So when we think of the flexible environment, think of your learners having different learning styles, different timelines for learning. Not everybody learns at the same pace. Think about learning happening in different spaces. It doesn't always happen in the classroom or in places that we traditionally think of as learning spaces. The learning culture refers to instruction being learner-centered. Think back to more of the traditional approach of the teacher being centered and giving information. Instead, in a flip, the instruction is in fact revolving around the learner. And by intentional content, we're talking about the content and the course design being structured to reflect a flip. In other words, The idea is that information or teaching is often happening outside of the class, and much more of the practice is happening in class. But of course, not just practice, also feedback. And that's where we talk about professional educator. It's important that the professional educator, the teacher, in this case often called a facilitator, is able to observe, provide feedback, reflect, and also, most importantly, tolerate organized chaos. And by this, we mean that learning can be messy. At times, you might have group work, and the groups can be very loud. And the professional educator, the teacher, has to be okay with that. Other definitions, in terms of the flipped classroom, you'll often hear, courtesy of EDUCAUSE, the flipped classroom is a pedagogical model in which the typical lecture and homework elements of a course are reversed. Now, this doesn't talk at all about the interactive environment. This is purely talking about reversing the homework and the explanation or lecture. But that's another key piece of a flip. Another definition would be that students gain first exposure, learning prior to class, and focus on the processing part of learning. So think about synthesizing, analyzing, problem solving. And that happens in class. Now that's a very important piece, because if we look at Bloom's taxonomy, think of lower order thinking skills, such as remembering, understanding. Those are the easier to sort of master skills, whereas the higher order thinking skills, such as applying, analyzing, evaluating, and most importantly, creating, those are a little bit more difficult and higher order thinking skills. Those are the types of skills we want to try to encourage and practice in class. So that's where part of the flip happens. It's moving a lot of the instruction inside to outside, creating the dynamic interactive space. So this picture to me really captures what a flip might look like. People often ask, well, what is it and what does it look like? Think of the traditional classroom on the left and the position of the teacher, and then look on the right. You can clearly see that the teacher on the right looks much more like a facilitator, a guide, so to speak. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, flipped classroom, flipped learning, that's great, but what about taking smaller steps? There's no need to try to go ahead and flip your entire classroom or flip all of your learning. Think about one step. And this is the image that I think of. You could leave today's webinar, hopefully, and take that one step toward flipping an element or a component of your class. Here's one easy way that some people flip, and it's a variation of a flip. Peer instruction. Students see content before class, and then quizzes are used to make sure students come to class prepared. It's a motivation technique. The teacher can then check understanding by using polling questions. Now, the clicker that you see is a great way of doing this. However, if you don't have access to a clicker or a cell phone, I'm going to talk about other non-technological ways of polling your students a little bit later in the presentation. So with peer instruction, what's so great about this is that if more than 30% of the class, or whatever you determine to be an important percentage, if they answer incorrectly, students can then discuss in small groups. Now, the instructor then listens. The role as a professional educator is to listen and provide feedback, and then the question is asked again. Now, hopefully, if some of the students understood the concept and were persuasive in convincing his or her partner, then you'll hopefully see that the answers have changed. What's great about the peer instruction approach is that peers are teaching peers, and that in many ways can be much more effective than constantly having to listen to the teacher. So what does it look like? Well, here's an example. In my class, I flipped a unit on Past Perfect. My students watched videos, and afterwards, first 5 minutes in class, I polled them, and this was one of my questions. So let's go ahead and take a poll for you. Is this form of the past perfect correct in this sentence? So you can choose definitely correct, maybe incorrect, definitely incorrect, or of course, no vote. it looks like there are some very opinionated people. I see a lot of you are very heavy on the definitely correct. You have 100% confidence, and there are some who are definitely incorrect. I'm sorry, it's definitely incorrect, which is about 87%, and the 7% which are definitely correct. Now, why do I use these terms of definitely or maybe? A lot of times we want to know how confident our students are about an answer. We want to raise their awareness. And so this is a good way for students to try to convince others. But how do we do that? Not by seeing who is the loudest participant, but who has the best reasoning for why his or her answer is correct. And in this case, my purpose for the question was to see if my students could identify the correct past participle, which would be written, not wrote. And so in that case, those of you 87% who said definitely incorrect, go ahead and pat yourself on the back. But now some of you might be turned off and say, oh, this technology, it's changing the world, and this flipping, it's not for me. Well, if you're in that situation, I asked you to listen a little bit longer to see if that is in fact true. Why? Well, think about it. Some say, I don't have access to technology. The world is constantly changing, and with more resources, the number of people with access to smartphones is growing every year. And a smartphone is an easy way to see a video, for example, that could be chosen, not just created by a teacher, but chosen by a teacher to share with his or her students. Even more, think of this analogy. Now, I'm in Washington, D.C., and recently we had a big snowstorm. Imagine if I waited to buy a snow shovel until it began to snow. I'd have no snow shovel, and I would have all of this snow in front of my house. Think about this analogy in terms of flipping. We, as educators, professional educators, should be looking for any way that we can to improve and enhance learning for our students. This is merely one way of doing it, and technology is one component of a flip. But I ask you today to think about ways that you can incorporate or implement aspects of this presentation into your own teaching by planning ahead. So, flipping. How might this apply to your context? Well, just listen through the presentation. You can determine what might work for you and what might not work for you. It's different in every context. Then you can determine whether you want to implement parts of the flip or continue doing what you are currently doing. Because the main reason here is that in flipping, half of the learning happens in class. Many people want to focus on the video, but in fact, what's happening in class is equally, if not more important than the video. So let's think about a traditional flip. In the ESL field, we don't really lecture, we explain, right? We might have very large classes, but in general, we're working off of explanations. Now, in the traditional flip, students read about a new grammar structure before the teacher explains it, and the reading is done for homework. So thinking about that, go ahead and just raise your hand if you do this. Do you assign reading and then possibly explain it in class? All right, so it looks like many of you do this. So this is an element or a component of flipping. So Robin Brinks-Lockwood at Stanford University says, students read at home, they do activities, and check answers with a partner in class, and then write, read, and practice and interact in class. That's a big piece of the flip. The writing, the reading, the practicing, and interacting are higher order skills. So a lot of what she's talking about as well is that our textbooks have value. There is no need to completely change everything we're doing in favor of technology, but we can think of other ways to make learning more interactive for our students. So at this point, we've talked about flipping, flipped, all these different terms, but basically just think of instruction moving outside of class and inside of class being more of the concept checking and practice. Now why? Why do we do this? Why do teachers decide to flip learning? Well, I can tell you my story. I flipped learning because of time. I've flipped learning to make my students hopefully more autonomous learners. And I'll give you more details about what I mean. But first, think about what's driving your learning train. And what I mean by that is it the technology? Are you here because everybody's talking about flipping? Are you here because it's required? I'm guessing that's not true. You're probably here because you want to improve student learning. That's what we do as teachers. That's our role. But how do we do that? In most teaching contexts, I think of it this way with this pyramid. You've got course objectives, your students, teacher, and at the top, your outcomes, which is what you want your students to be able to perform or do at the end of a course. Now, I had this idea a while back where I really started thinking more about this pyramid. And really, the role of a teacher and teaching itself doesn't really matter. Don't get me wrong, it's important, but what is most important at the top of the pyramid is that we get our students to achieve the outcomes that we have in our class. Now, how you do that might be different depending on a class or your context. But I think if we keep that in mind, the approach, the method that you might use can vary. So think about it. Why flip? I said time. Now, for me, this is a very powerful quote. We didn't get to that because we didn't have time. Let's go ahead and just take a poll. How many of you, yes or no, have ever said that during a class or after a class? Unbelievable. I saw numbers around 80%, 90%, 85%. Thank you for being honest. Being honest as well, I am guilty. I have said this, and it makes me reflect. It makes me reflect as a teacher, and self-reflection is very powerful and very good. Why? Because think about time. Time for what? How is class time spent? How much practice time is there for students? A lot of times when we run out of time in a class, what do we eliminate? What do we cut out? The practice, right? In favor of more teacher-taught time. So really, in the flipping, practice is the key. And you've got to know why you're doing it. You've got to know why you're flipping. Now, for me, Derek Bruff from Vanderbilt University wrote an article, and it was titled, "I've flipped my classroom, now what?" It's interesting that he had to write this article for other people because they had the questions. To me, this is shocking, because if you don't know why you're flipping, then it doesn't make sense. If you're flipping because your reason is time, to create more time in class and more practice, then you start looking at your task-based teaching and the authentic practice and tasks that you want your students to do, and you use those with the time in class. That's the main reason why many people flip. So here's an analogy, and I think for me, this is a very powerful analogy as a student, not just as a teacher. Here's really why I flip learning. You think of this train right here, okay? And this train, you have a choice, basically. This train makes many stops. It doesn't go just from point A to point B. But you've also got another choice. As a traveler, you can take this fast train. And this train skips point B, it skips point C, it skips point D, and goes straight to point G, for example. Now, for most students, if they know they're going to point G, they would rather go straight to point G. But let's think about it. If you have this map of train stations, and let's say that the train stations on the map reflect student questions in class. Now your teacher, the train conductor, is teaching present perfect. And you, as a student, have already studied and practiced present perfect. You know it, you just need more time practicing it. But the conductor is spending a lot of time teaching or explaining the present perfect on the first day of class. And a lot of students have never studied it, and they're asking questions. Again, the questions represent train stops. How do you feel as a learner? All you want to do is take your trip to present perfect town and practice, and yet you can't because of the train stops. To me, we've all had that feeling as a learner on the strong end of being frustrated and bored, and on the maybe the lower end where we've been a little bit lost. So what flipping really does is it helps to pace your learning and teaching. It makes it more individualized. For me, day one of a new unit can be painful as a teacher, and it's painful for many of my students. So what I try to do to not make them bored or not lost is eliminate the day one fear and surprise by evening the playing field. Evening the playing field means that everybody starts more or less at the same starting point. Now, some students will have more background knowledge about the present perfect, but by evening the playing field, the students who are on the lower end at least have been exposed to it before day one, so they don't have the basic questions. And the lecture or explanation, you're able to go faster at a faster pace, and the students are better able to ask good questions on day one. How is that? Well, flipping on day one of a unit can eliminate the meta-language component. Meta-language just means the fancy terms in grammar. If I give my students a video on what comma splices and fragments are, the next day in class, they can actually ask, why is this a fragment and why is this a comma splice? That's on the very first day of our unit. That means the pacing has improved and they're able to ask good questions and reflect. Also, the instruction is not controlled by the pace of the slowest nor the fastest. We as teachers often get trapped into answering every question rather than thinking that maybe every question is not good. It's not the best practice to answer every question. So my context is I participated or conducted a flipped grammar project in 2012 and 2013 with a colleague, Jennifer Lubkin, at Georgetown University, and we flipped units in an intermediate grammar class. And this was a lot of work, in fact, over 300 plus hours of materials creation, research, and analysis. It's important to note that we each taught our own classes in an intermediate grammar class. Now, we had two research questions. How does a flipped approach impact the type and extent of learning activities? And does the curriculum increase learning effectiveness? Now, in terms of our context, we used Open Learning Initiative, otherwise called OLI. This was a platform, an electronic platform or learning platform from Carnegie Mellon University. And the two units that we flipped with technology were past perfect and phrasal verbs. It's important to note that we flipped several other units traditionally. So for those of you who do not have access to technology, a lot of the ways that we flipped many grammar structures was by giving grammar charts and readings as first exposure to the grammar before getting into the unit. Okay, so further points about our context. The students watched the videos and completed their homework in the learning platform, OLI. Now, in class, we did concept checking with clickers, and then practice and feedback was provided. Now think of it from a low-tech standpoint. Instead of using the platform, during those units, students read grammar explanations and charts in the textbook and completed exercises. So with OLI, it was nice because we were able to see what the students did for work outside of class. We could track their learning with percentages for each question. Now, this was a nice luxury that technology provided us. In addition to that, we could see that I could track individual students and see who had participated in the homework. I could see which problems students were having. That way, you can think about it. When we came to class the next day, I had already looked to see what they had done, and we were able to discuss the problematic points. It is such a great luxury because when you think about it, time. We don't spend time focusing on every practice problem. If the students understood it, I didn't talk about it. But what does this do? This enables students to have a better opportunity to reach the outcomes of the course. Why? Because it means more practice. Now, at this point, you might be thinking about what the students think about this. What do English language learners actually think about flipped learning? I've been watching the chat box and listening to a lot of people, and there's a lot of excitement about it. But does that translate to all of the students? Well, it was a mixed bag. In other words, there were diverse reactions to the flipping approach. On the positive side, many students liked the platform, OLI. They liked the videos and getting immediate feedback on their homework. It's great. At the same time, some students were a bit opposed to some of the inductive learning in class. Now, this is the flipping part that happens in class. And a lot of the way that we practiced grammar was by having students discover rules, by learning how to use the grammar, not necessarily teaching explicitly. Some students did not like that. Why? We'll talk more about this later, but think of the traditional approach. Many students might not be used to this. Some students didn't want to learn from a book for a preview. They wanted the teacher to provide explanations. And when the teachers didn't provide the explanations in class, there's a bit of a conflict in how students and teachers perceive learning. Here's a common student quote in flipped learning. I'm not able to ask questions when I have some problems understanding something. And that's very true. When you're at home watching a video, you actually cannot ask a question. You have to wait until the next class. Another quote, I don't know how I'm improving, but I am. Now, to me, this reflects the student's thoughts on inductive learning. This student realized I'm actually not being taught explicitly or lectured to, but I am improving my learning and I'm improving my grammar. Another example, a student reacted in the teacher evaluation saying, I suggest when we take one lesson, please don't move to other lesson before you make sure all of the student understand 100%. This is a very powerful quote because it does not reflect the way that I think of learning, but think about it. If your students are seeing learning this way, we need to find a way to bridge the gap, to make sure that we are on the same page. We understand each other and where we're coming from. Another quote was she wanted us to learn by ourselves from the book. Get back to the conventional strategy, which is using the board. So again, in these cases, not all students were happy, so to speak, about not getting as many explanations in class. Now, what did students actually think about the videos? I asked them, do you think these videos help you learn? And overwhelmingly, you can see that no student said a little or not at all. All said at least some. And that's powerful, and it's very useful to ask your students their opinions about the videos, about their experience in flipping, because that way you can apply change. This is a very simple way of doing it. We often think as teachers, we read body language. We read what our students are sending in terms of body signals. And we don't know if they actually are enjoying class or not sometimes. So we created this piece of paper, and at the end of class, it takes 1 minute for students to report their opinions on the class. Now, for many teachers, you might think, oh, I don't care what my students think about class. This is the way I teach. But in fact, think about how empowering it is if students can actually tell you and give feedback on whether or not they found the class useful. So it's a very simple tool to check and see how students perceive or view your class. Another quote from Robin Brinks Lockwood is, what do ELLs think about flipping? She doesn't tell her students. I, in fact, do not tell my students either. Now, during this project, we did, because it was part of a research project. But this is really up to you. You have the trust, hopefully, of your students, and they trust you as a professional educator that you have the students' best interests in mind. So that's a choice that you can make. Now, let's transition and talk a little bit about who our students are. Millennials. 3 learning strategies to engage millennials. Now, millennials are people who are born in the early 1980s up until the early 2000s. Let's go ahead and take a poll, yes or no, on whether or not you teach millennials in your context. Okay, I don't even know why I asked the question. It looks like almost all of you do. And if you don't, there's a good chance you will. Why is that important? It's really important because we need to engage millennials. Many people think that videos are great, but it's not just videos. You've got to be aware of how long your video is. How concise is your video? How exciting is your video? You cannot just take what you're teaching in class on a chalkboard, film it, and send it to your students and expect them to enjoy it. So let's go back and think about some of the letters in FLIP. The trust in the student relationship with the teacher, in my opinion, is in fact more important than the technology. Why? Because again, the in-class interaction with the teacher will not be replaced. We might shift and have teaching take place in other places, but the role of the teacher is equally important in a FLIP. You are just more of a facilitator. Now the L, which is the learning culture. We think of different learning styles. If you know that your students prefer videos, it might be a good way to engage them. If you know that some students really like reading from a book, then you can find ways to reach them. But we've got to keep in mind learning preferences and styles. Moving on to the intentional content, this really just means that the idea behind this approach is that it be through a flip. That flipping happen by shifting the instruction outside of class and practice inside of class. And that when you're doing that, you've got to be aware that some students might not be used to that. So in that case, you might want to explain in some ways why in fact you are doing that and that you have their best interests in mind. Again, because the perceptions are different. The way that I perceive learning is often very different from how my students perceive learning. So we have to have that dialogue. We actually have to have that discussion so that we understand each other. My students often think of learning as this. I don't really see this as learning. I see this as teaching. For me, this is learning. In the title of the presentation, learning to me is in a group. You can learn in a group. It's an adventure. It's exciting. Learning means getting yourself dirty, getting yourself muddy. But to many students, it might not be. And so we need to have that discussion. Now, another way that we can get feedback from students is through surveys. And for me, I asked 34 students in my grammar classes, advanced and intermediate, would you rather read a grammar explanation in a book, read a grammar explanation online, or receive a video link? Let's go ahead and take a poll and see what your preferences are. All right, so it looks like most of you, 68%, like to receive a video link. But there's still a large percentage who would rather read. What does that mean? Well, at least we've identified our student preferences, and we can consider those before we go forward, flipping our entire classroom. So it's something to think about. So you can see you are very similar to my students. About 2/3 preferred videos, but not all. It's important to keep in mind. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, how do I make the videos exciting? I don't have the magic solution, but I have at least taken feedback from students to try to make my videos more of a dialogue, a conversation with them and engaging. Here in this clip, we're going to take a look at how my students might watch a passive video before using it on day one of a new unit. Where were you born? Just for fun, go ahead and answer in a complete sentence. I was born in Virginia. In other words, my mother bore me in Virginia. Sounds pretty funny, doesn't it? That's because the verb bear, the past tense is bore, and the past participle is born. Just like for the verb wear, we got wear, wore, and worn. You can see this kid is wearing a costume for Halloween. Have you ever worn a costume? And the same thing is true for the verb tear. Tear, tore, torn. So you can see a pattern happening. So what did I do here? Yeah, I tore the paper. So this is just an example of how students might be introduced to the passive. Now that video was approximately 7 minutes, and it's not going to solve all the problems of the passive. But my idea by the end of that video is that students come to class on day 1 at least understanding how the passive is formed. Not the meaning, not the use, but how do they form it. And again, that's on the low end of Bloom's taxonomy of skills. Now, I've talked a lot about what flipping is, why people flip. Let's look at how to flip. Now, there are 2 different roads you could take. One which includes more technology, and the other which is a more traditional, simplified approach. And both can be very useful. Now, these are a lot of the resources that I use when I'm using technology in order to flip elements of my class. I've posted other links in the Ning, and I welcome you to explore them and participate in the discussion. Now, for those of you who might be flipping with less technology, one possible approach can be, if you know you don't have internet access, that you might be able to download YouTube videos and then access them later with a memory stick, for example. Another approach could be about polling. Now remember, earlier in the webinar, I talked about polling. Now I poll every day in class without technology. I ask students to show fingers or hold up colored paper. So for example, if they want to answer A, it's 1, B, it's 2, C is 3, and D is 4. Now, just for fun, let's go ahead and take a poll here. We've got global temperatures, blank, for many years. Say, are rising, rose, have risen, have raised? Okay, if we were taking a poll, some of you might say A, B, D, not quite sure. But this is really fun for my students because even though they're not using technology, I love it because I get to see, in fact, what each student thinks without being persuaded by other students. So a very simple way, again, to flip without technology. Another approach could be just thinking, well, should I really be flipping? Mostly because, for me, it's really effective because for me, creating video means I can sometimes make it more engaging than just the teaching part. I can make stories more interesting with pictures. Students can actually go back and rewatch the video. And then afterwards, really, you don't get caught giving explanations in class as a teacher without really having thought about the grammar. Students often don't like that because it means your explanation is longer. And I don't know about you, but I'm not a very good artist. So finding better pictures for my videos is more appealing to my students. Another approach when you're flipping with less technology is to think about how to model for your students. Now, I mean, how do we demonstrate effective strategies? Well, one way is show model student work. If a student did a great job on the homework, show it. If students come to class prepared and they do well on the quiz for the flip, tell them, reward them. But also, don't forget to give them quizzes, because when you're flipping, even if your quizzes are not for a grade, there's no motivation for students. That's not correct. There's less motivation for students to come to class and be prepared if they are not being held accountable for the content and the material. So make sure that you are checking the comprehension. Let's rewind. Earlier in the presentation, I said, Flipping can better prepare students to ask good questions earlier in the unit. How? It's not magic. This doesn't just happen. And in fact, it happens through support. We need to actually structure our students. Think of our students as this building, and we are the scaffolding around it. We actually need to provide the structure, and then later we can be removed. But our students need to know what are the expectations. It needs to be very explicit how you want students to approach the flipped homework, because otherwise they're often lost. For example, how to model effective behaviors. Treat the videos like lectures. They're not movies. It's just like an explanation in class to which they can take notes. They can then bring their notes to class and be prepared to ask questions. And not only that, I expect them to do that. And I tell them that before we flip. Now, if you're in a situation with less technology or none, think about it for reading assignments. If you give your students grammar charts or readings, tell them to highlight it, show them how to take notes and annotate. Force them to bring questions to class. Don't just ask them to. Require each student to bring one question to class. And then make sure that you, again, also quiz them. Check their concept learning in these cases. These are a couple of the ways. And again, why do we do this? I tell you from experience. My view is, okay, students, go home. You watch the video, take notes, and then naturally you'll come to my class and ask questions. We know that's not what happens. Students think of it this way. I have a question right now. I'm doing the homework right now, and I need an answer right now. And they don't necessarily write down their thoughts or questions. And they come to class and they've forgotten. So now you might be asking, well, how can I help make my students more autonomous learners, more independent learners, in other words? For me, this is a classic student quote. I had a student ask me, are you going to teach us? I laughed first, but then I thought about it and I reflected, and it really made sense. The student really assumed I was not teaching, which is somewhat true. Because think of the Chinese proverb, your teacher can open the door, but you must enter by yourself. If we're thinking about really learning, not just teaching. So that's where, again, the teaching and the learning diverge in some areas, or they go separate ways. They're not necessarily always one and the same. Now, thinking about class time, another classic student quote. This is a great one for a poll. We know the grammar, we just need to practice it. Have you heard this in your class or after class, in any class? Go ahead and let's take a poll, yes or no. I'm sorry, raise your hand if you have heard this. I knew it. I'm seeing a lot of hands go up. It's true, and students are not wrong. Oftentimes they do know it. Think about it, remembering grammar. Think about memorizing grammar or identifying it. It's very different from being able to use it. So give them some credit, our students. So let's look quickly. There are different ways that we can teach. For example, a structure like present perfect. You could do it with a PowerPoint, a chalkboard explanation, a handout, other. Now, another option could be in the flip, you could give them textbook explanations or video explanations. Maybe have the students discover the grammar. But in a flip, the unit progression often works like this. On day one, we check for concepts, recognition. Day two, you can make sure that they understand errors and can identify errors and maybe perform some tasks. And by day three, we're doing much more of the authentic practice. So that's a typical progression, at least for me, in a flip. What does it look like? Well, it means that I don't explicitly teach the present tense. We flip, we talk about reasons for why it's used and discover it, and we spend more time actually doing an interview, because in an interview, students actually need to use present tense to say, I'm from this place, I work here, I study here. You actually need to use present tense to describe your characteristics. Now, the role of the teacher, again, is to provide feedback. So we can't just do these tasks in class, these interviews, without having feedback, because the students want and need the corrective feedback. So the practice plus the feedback hopefully should equal engaged students. I don't know. This would be a good question for later at some point, but do happy, engaged students mean better learners? Let's go ahead and take a poll. Do you think that happy, engaged learners are more effective or better learners? So we have 93%, 94% who say yes. Another 4% maybe. I'm not saying it's 100% true, but I do think that it's much more likely that happy, engaged students will be better learners. And I'm sure the research supports that in most cases. So now we've talked about what flipping is and why to flip. Let's look at how to flip. One of the components that I flip in my class is the syllabus. In other words, the plans for a class and instructions. So students watch a video before the first day of class, and I use VoiceThread as far as the technology is concerned. So it looks like this. My students can actually see I've shared the syllabus with them. They can read it, and they hear me explain it, so they actually get to meet me before the first day of class. And why do I do that? Because really the syllabus takes potentially 15, 20, or 30 minutes in class. Now imagine millennials listening to that. It can be boring. It can be the same information if you have continuing students and new students in the same place, the same classroom. Now, another way you can do this, one is through VoiceThread, clearly. It's great because then they come to class and they're able to answer questions, polling, check their understanding of the syllabus. It's like a game. It's a form of gamification. And I'll talk more about what I mean by gamification in a minute. But let's just say, for example, you don't want to use the technology. It's a traditional approach. Maybe you might flip your syllabus and have students actually read the syllabus for homework, come to class, answer questions about it in class so that everybody's clear about your class policies. Maybe you could do it in the form of a game with pairs and groups and teams, or possibly as a scavenger hunt. And that way you really only talk about the difficult questions that students had. It can be more fun. You could go ahead and maybe raise your hand if you in fact do use a syllabus in your course. So it looks like many of you do, and that could be a good approach if you'd like to consider starting flipping. So the two approaches, the non-tech and the tech, but there's also modeling the tools. So online tools, how do we model them for our students? I'm going to talk briefly about this, but I'd like to share with some of the time running out, some of the tools that I do use and ways that you can actually flip. So these are 3 tools that I use. Again, I posted some of these in the resources. You could go through and see. The gamification is really the application of game design elements and game principles in non-game contexts. It means making learning fun. One way that we do that is with Quizlet. And if you have access to internet, it's a great way for students to practice spelling and vocabulary. I have my students do flashcards on their phone, create their own words for spelling. It's a great tool to use in class and outside class. If, for example, a student in my class writes here, I might go on to Quizlet for 1 minute in my class and start playing. Why? It teases them. They get addicted and they want to play. I stop. I say, if you want to continue playing, do it at home. Here's the link. It makes learning fun. Another is Dragon Dictation. It's a dictation app, and you can find other resources in the link. One document that I use every day in class is shared class notes in a Google Doc. If you have access to Google Drive or Gmail, this is instead of writing on the chalkboard. I write in a Google Doc, and I share it with all of my students. That way they can access this outside of class, and everything we do in class lives there. So if, for example, I hear a student mispronounce or use the wrong part of speech for colonize or colony or colonial or colonization, it's very easy for me to quickly pull up Google, show some visuals, show how intonation works, and students can access this outside of class through the Google Doc because it's shared with them. They love it. It's a good way of modeling the tools for your students. Another one is EduCanon, which again, I'll share through the Ning, so I won't go into too many details. But if you do have access to the internet, this is a great tool to use for listening purposes and grammar. The best part about EduCanon is you can upload videos and provide immediate feedback for students. At this point, I'd like to stop for a second and just give you some of my final thoughts or advice on flipping, and more importantly, integrating in-class learning with online activities. Know your context, number one. Everybody teaches in a different context. Flipping doesn't work in every context for everybody, for every skill. Consider it, decide, see if it's right for you. Also, the best products are products that provide solutions. Think about any product that you know in business. Hopefully, the best ones are usually started because they solve problems. If you don't perceive a problem in your class, flipping might not be right for you. Remember the picture with the images of the steps going up. Start small. Take one element from this presentation and try to implement it in your class. And don't just do it without asking your students. Ask them how they feel about it. Survey them, poll them, and then iterate. In other words, make changes to what you're doing. And then repeat. Do it again, and you will build confidence. But don't just assume that everything will be perfect. Mistakes are okay. We as teachers are professionals, yes, but we are humans. Mistakes are good learning opportunities. My students, I ask them to trust me, and they know that I'm working for them. They know when I make mistakes, it's with their interest in mind. And as long as we talk about that and have that dialogue, you will earn their trust, they will respect you. Finally, ask yourself, how can I get my students to achieve the learning outcomes most efficiently? If you feel like what you're doing is currently working, that's great, but I feel like we can always reflect as teachers and find ways to better serve our students. Hopefully you found some of these ways useful, and regardless of the technology, you can implement or apply them in your own teaching context. I had a great time speaking with you today, and I look forward to participating on the Ning afterwards. Here are some of the sources that I used. Thank you very much.